Erie. Thanks, Susie. Right at 1 o'clock, and we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, I believe, second day of spring, although it's kind of cold where I'm at. It's a little chilly at, let's see, 36 degrees. We are so glad that you could join us this afternoon. This is the 5th session of the Administrator Forum webinars. These webinars are being held in collaboration between the Early Childhood Development Department at the Illinois State Board of Education and Early Childhood Professional Learning at the Center Resources for Teaching and Learning, we're also known as ECPL for short. My name is Cindy Berry, and I'm with ECPL. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please be sure your name in the participant list is the same first and last name you used to register for this session. We need this for attendance purposes, and so please edit it if necessary to make sure we have your first and last name so we can confirm your attendance. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the ECPL YouTube channel within the upcoming week. Due to the large number of participants, your microphones will be muted throughout the session. However, we encourage you to write your comments and questions in the chat. The chat will remain open throughout the session. And our presenters today really encourage you to engage with them. So if you would like to speak, please feel free to use the raise hand emoji and unmute yourself to ask your question or make a comment. We ask you also to remain in the session until the end because we have some important announcements about future events. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Jenny Metcalf, who is a principal consultant in the Early Childhood Development Department at ISB.
Hi, everybody. Jenny Metcalf. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a principal consultant at ISB in early childhood. For those of you who've been to every session so far, it's great to see you again. We appreciate your support. To those of you who this is your first monthly session, welcome. You picked a good one. Before we get started, I want to just give one more plug, as I've been doing, for our in-person administrator conference that will be held on April 22nd and 23rd in Champaign. We have a large registration already, but we do have some spots left. We would love to see at least one administrator from each of our PFAE programs in attendance in Champaign. So the link would have been in some of the emails you received about today from ECPL. You can also go to the ECPL website, and the registration link is on there too. All the early childhood staff will be there, so you'll be able to talk to your consultant. And we also have some really great sessions and presenters during that day. So we look forward to seeing everyone. So back to today, we are excited. This is exciting for us because we're having a two-part webinar. This is the first of a two-part webinar on foundations of effective job-embedded professional development. The second session will be on April 10th, and we are joined today by Chris Miller, who is an early childhood practice consultant at Start Early, and we hope you really enjoy it. Chris, on to you.
Wow, thanks, Jenny. Really appreciate that. Let me again welcome everybody here. Today's topic, as you can see from the slide, is the foundations of effective job-embedded professional development. And as Jenny said, my name is Chris Miller. I'm going to be presenting and facilitating today. And my role is that of early childhood practice consultant. I work at an organization called Start Early, which is an early childhood organization based here in Chicago. You might be familiar with us by that name or by our previous name, which was the Ounce of Prevention Fund. You might see slides and videos that contain the old Ounce of Prevention logo. Just know that we are the same people, the same organization. We just like to make sure that we are using the content that we feel is tried and true. Thank you very much to Jenny and to Cindy for inviting us to present today. And I also want to thank Susie Finn, who's going to be providing technical assistance today. I think if you have any issues, you can always directly use the chat function to reach out to her if you're having any challenges, especially if you find yourself getting locked out of Zoom rooms or have any other technical difficulties that you encounter. I'm seeing a lot of the names coming in as people are entering the room and sharing their personal information, and so many of those names are familiar to me. Many of you are people who I've had the opportunity to work with over the past 10 years. Many of you are also alumni of a professional development offering that was offered by Start Early in the Autism Prevention. It used to be called Lead, Learn, Excel. Now it's called the Essential Fellowship. But I have so many memories of so many of you, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Here's a little sneak peek of what you can anticipate from this next hour and a half together, our agenda for today. We're going to start with this overview and briefly sharing some group norms and our learning objectives. We're going to do a quick activator to get you thinking about today's topic. And then we're going to be talking very briefly about the achievement and the opportunity gaps, and specifically the implications of those two things for children and the educators that we support. We're going to be talking about adult knowledge development and adult. The fancy name for that, just learned, is andragogy. And we'll talk about what that looks like and how that should inform professional development that we offer to our staff. We also want to spend some time thinking about how other leading early childhood organizations have defined professional development and unpack some of those definitions together. We'll be wrapping up by talking about and comparing traditional versus job-embedded definitions of what professional development is. And at the very end, we're going to ask you to provide us with a little bit of feedback with a brief survey that we'll be sharing with you and asking you to complete. We want to share some group norms with you as well. These are norms that we use internally whenever we come together as a team at Start Early. These are also norms that we use in all of our professional development offerings, and we hope that they'll feel relevant to you today. First, we want to encourage everyone to monitor your airtime, which is encouraging you to think out loud. But if you're a person who finds yourself speaking a lot, maybe you need to step back once in a while. If you're a person who often likes to hang in the background, encourage yourself to step forward and share. We want to hear as many diverse voices as we can. Second, we want to encourage you to speak from your own personal experience using I statements. Don't speak on behalf of anybody else or a different community or group. Third, we hope that you'll lead with curiosity and not judgment. Let's get curious about the ideas that people share, but try to separate the idea from the person and really seek to understand even if we don't agree. We hope that you will commit to being fully present as well. That's especially important today when we meet in a virtual setting like this. This is going to be at times an interactive experience. We'll be having whole group and small group discussions and activities in some activities in breakout rooms. So we hope that you'll be able to eliminate distractions, turn your cameras on, and be able to commit to your own learning and that of your peers by participating to the fullest extent that you're able. We want to remind you that what is learned can leave, but what is said should stay, which is just another way of saying, let's try to maintain the privacy and confidentiality of any discussions that we take place in today. We also encourage you to find that learning space between your comfort zone and your danger zone. To learn at our best, we have to push ourselves outside of those comfort zones, but we don't want you to push yourself so far that you feel unsafe. So please be aware of your own feelings and step back if you need to. And finally, we want to encourage you to take ownership for the impact of your words. We know that there's a big difference between intent and impact sometimes. And sometimes what is intended is not always how it's received. We want this to be a safe space where you can be honest with each other and we can be open without judgment. So it's important that we recognize that our words do have impact and that while we may not mean something to land a certain way, sometimes it does. And if it does, we should acknowledge it and own that impact and try to follow up if you feel that it's necessary. So what will you get from today's session? Today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the first three learning objectives that you see there. We'll be touching on the latter two more so in our second session on April 10th. But today, we really hope that first, you'll leave with a sense of what embedded professional development is. You've got a good definition of it in your head. Secondly, we hope that you as our learners will be able to identify some of the major principles of effective adult learning. What do adults need to effectively learn? And third, we hope that you as our learners will be able to contrast the mindsets, the methods, and the practices of traditional professional development with the model that we're putting forth today, embedded professional development. And then our other two learning objectives that we'll also be touching on: one, understand why collaborative job-embedded professional development is desirable. What are the benefits of participating in it? And finally, what are the major elements of the job-embedded approach to professional development? What characterizes it or helps to differentiate it from other kinds of PD? Those are our learning hopes for you today. So let's begin with a little activator. I'd like you to use the chat function right now. And please share the first feeling that arises for you when those two words, professional development, are raised. What comes to mind for you? Growth, extra work, learning, skill building, mindsets, continuous learning, team building, opportunities, advancement, knowledge, new learning opportunities, more tools in the toolbox, workshops/passive trainings was someone's comment. Someone else said trainings, continuous improvement. New ideas. Another person who said more work. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing those. For some of you, the feelings that you shared were very positive ones. For others, maybe not so positive. The idea of more work, that might be appealing to you, maybe not appealing to everybody. I'm guessing that how you responded has a lot to do with how you've generally experienced PD in the past. And I don't think that's necessarily true in most of the comments that we're getting here, but I think for a lot of educators and people in this field, PD does not always have a positive connotation. And so we want to talk a little bit about why that might be the case today, but more specifically, what are our responsibilities as leaders in changing that? And to do that, we need to understand how traditional professional development in our field might have been lacking in some cases, or might not always meet the needs of adult professionals in early childhood. So we'll be getting to that in a few minutes, but before we dig into that topic, let's think about why there's an urgent need for good PD in the first place in our field. And to do that, that's going to take us back to two terms that I'm sure you have all heard a lot and are very familiar with, and those terms are the achievement gap and the opportunity gap. Really quickly, what do we mean by those terms? We want to make sure that we have a shared definition of them. And here's how we define them at Start Early. When we're talking about the achievement gap, we say that that's the significant and persistent differences in academic performance or educational attainment that exists between different groups of students or children. And that typically impacts children who are experiencing poverty compared to children who have access to greater resources. Then, hand in hand with that idea of the achievement gap is the opportunity gap. And by that, we're really talking about the disparity in access to high quality schools or educational settings, and also to the resources that are needed for all children to be academically successful. So those two go hand in hand, but they're not identical. The achievement gap describes those perceived differences in performance, especially as they're measured by standardized tests, while that opportunity gap describes the situation that causes that achievement gap in the first place. Namely, the fact that children and families with less access to resources are less likely to succeed because they lack those prerequisites that are necessary for success. And we know what those prerequisites are: safe neighborhoods, adequate food and shelter, enriching opportunities, and what's especially important to our conversation today, access to high quality educational opportunities in early childhood and beyond. So Here's a few facts to kind of undergird what we know about the achievement and opportunity gap. In the United States today, there's approximately 6 million children under the age of 6 that are experiencing poverty. We also know that children who grow up experiencing poverty are a lot more likely to enter kindergarten up to 2 years behind better resourced peers. We've also heard, at least you've probably heard this on many occasions, that children who grow up experiencing poverty or persistent poverty are typically hearing on average 30 million fewer words by the time they are 3 than their better resourced peers. And we could share a lot more data with you that would help to illustrate this. And I'm sure it's data that you're all probably very well familiar with at this point. I don't think that we need to preach to the choir here, but those facts never cease to be sobering or depressing to me. Why are we sharing that? Well, I guess the point is, as you're probably all well aware, is that many children, the children that we support and provide care and services to, are behind before they even start their early childhood experience. So the importance for us to prepare our educators and family support staff to be engaged in meaningful, continuous learning has never been greater. Simply put, good PD for our staff has never been more important. So what does this mean for professional development in early childhood? What does this mean for families and family engagement? The importance of preparing early childhood educators to be engaged in meaningful, continuous learning has never been greater. And the most effective way to ensure the competence of our staff is through impactful professional development that truly changes educator practice. Good PD leads to better instruction and better interactions with children, and that in turn leads to better child and family outcomes. And isn't that what early childhood is all about? So what do we mean when we talk about effective PD? Before we try to define that, let's spend a little time thinking about adult learning theory and the transfer of learning to practice. Recent advances in brain science have proven to us that if learning is constant and ongoing after an initial training, that staff person is much more likely to retain more of that information, but even more importantly, to apply it effectively on the job when it's needed. So in the article, Spacing Learning Events Over Time, what the research says, the author reminds us that although learning and memory is strongest during a learning event, the knowledge that they gain is rapidly forgotten afterwards. And speaking from my own personal experience, I can attest to that. You might be in the middle of a learning experience and it feels so relevant at the time. It feels so vital. It feels like something you really want to use, but your retention of that information is very low. And the further away from that learning experience we get, the less likely we are to remember what we learned, and the less likely we are to put that into practice. So the author of that article says that spacing out reinforcement of on-the-job training enhances how much people are going to remember from that training, and it also directly connects to how much they're going to apply what they've learned to their own work. And that means providing those extended supports after that initial knowledge building has taken place is really necessary to transfer that new knowledge into meaningful practice. This slide helps to build on that point. You know, to improve actual practice, knowledge building is just the start. And unfortunately, that's where usually most professional development begins and ends. But the goal of professional development is to really fully integrate that new knowledge and be able to apply it on a consistent, basis and to apply it strategically in the situations when we need it. So I really want to draw your attention to what you see highlighted in yellow on this slide. The goal of professional development is to fully integrate new knowledge and apply it consistently and strategically. The struggle isn't in learning a new skill, it's in successfully implementing it. Here's another slide that helps to make that point. And even though this research is a little bit older, I think it still applies, largely because we're still doing the same kinds of traditional PD that we've always done. So this research is by Bruce Joyce and Beverly Showers. It's from about 2002, so we're talking over 20 years ago now. But it's a powerful statement, I think, about why our current approach to professional development needs to be replaced with systems of sustained, collaborative, job-embedded approaches to professional learning. So let's look at these numbers here. You can see that training, even when training is high quality and involves some demonstration and the opportunity to practice during that training, is still utterly insufficient in its ability to change daily practice. So look at that last column over there on the right. It shows that when participants have the opportunity even to practice those new skills during a training and to get feedback on those efforts during a training, the likelihood of them then using that skill in the classroom is only about 5%. 5%. But look at the number that's also circled in red below it. That shows the percentage of participants in a training who use new skills in a classroom. And that percentage jumps from 5% up to 95% when quality training is paired with coaching and on-the-job supports afterwards. I'll let that think in for a second, or sink in for a second. There is a 90% greater chance that your staff are going to be applying what they have learned if we're able to provide those sustained transfer of knowledge to practice supports in our own settings. I want to share a very short video with right now that examines the importance of transfer to knowledge to practice. It's a little over a minute long. Let's watch it together.
Let's spend some time thinking and learning about adult knowledge development and the transfer of knowledge to practice. Have you ever heard or thought,
I got into early childhood because I love working with children. I didn't realize I'd be working with adults so much.
Many early childhood educators experience a shift when they begin working with young children because they quickly learn that in order to provide the best possible learning experiences for children, intentional collaboration with adults is critical. But there is often little to no training provided for early childhood educators in adult knowledge development prior to beginning their work in a program.
It turns out the adults aren't so bad to work with after all. But here's the thing. I know about best practices for supporting children's learning and knowledge development, but what about the adults?
Understanding adult learning theory is important for a variety of reasons. Why might a deeper understanding of adult learning theory be beneficial to you in your work?
Let's think about that. How might a deeper understanding of adult learning theory and the needs of adult learners be beneficial to you as an early childhood leader? How could it benefit your staff? And how could it benefit the children and the families you support? I'd love to hear a few thoughts along those lines. If you want to put them in the chat, feel free to. If you'd like to raise your hand and share out loud, that would be even better. We'd love to hear from a few people. How do you think that your staff, the children and families you support, would benefit if you better understood the needs of adult learners? If you'd like to use the raise hand function, please feel free to do so. We'd love to hear from you. I see one comment from Vicky already in the chat mentioning benefit from children if my teachers are learning more. Christy mentioned different modalities to cover the different learning styles that support children. Yeah, that's important for adults as well as for kids. Paula, that's a great comment, I see. Paula mentioned people feel less frustrated and more open to learning if they have an understanding of adult learning theories. Yeah, they're going to get a lot more out of the trainings that we provide and the supports that we offer to them. Other people are talking about the importance of collaboration, of learning from each other, not just a sit and get, but the value of peers. Hi, Felice. Thanks for raising your hand. Go ahead. Please unmute yourself. We'd
Hello.
love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I think that it's important to understand and know and research adult learning theory because a lot of us, we are very experienced in teaching kids. And a lot of times when we're presenting information, we're presenting it and using all of those strategies and toolbox that we have when we work with young children and kids. And we forget sometimes that adults learn in completely different ways. And so I think it's important that we are intentional about making sure that we include some of those strategies and theories in our professional learning.
Thanks, Felice. I'm going to ask you one more question. So if you don't mind staying unmuted, what do you think are some of the things that adult learners need? In your experience,
Well,
what makes an adult, what differentiates an adult learning experience from maybe one that's appropriate for kids?
So one of the things that I've been doing that I think is making a little bit of a difference is instead of just giving out the information. So for example, let's say we're talking about adult learning theory or professional learning or whatever that is, having them research and then bring something to the table themselves that they found and start out with that instead of being kind of like the expert or giving them the information, starting out with that so that I can kind of gauge where they're coming from. And also they feel like they are taking a better part in that learning.
Great, thank you. So having some ownership for learning. It's not just to sit and get, but giving them the responsibility to seek out information and to be experts on their own can be really valuable. Thanks so much. And so many of the comments I'm seeing in the chat really support that as well. People are talking about different learning experiences. They're talking about focusing on how teachers learn. Ongoing, oh, someone mentioned throughout the year, so the ongoing nature of learning. Wonderful. Let me pose another question to you. How are you currently supporting your educators in transferring new knowledge into practice in their work with children and families? What supports do you currently provide that you think contribute to this kind of transfer to practice? First comment mentions visiting other classrooms. Yes, giving teachers the opportunity to do observations in other rooms. Self-reflection. Another mention of classroom visits. Sam mentioned modeling. Differentiating trainings by position or role. Great. Professional goal settings for individual professional goal setting. Peer-to-peer observations. Someone else mentioned targeted PD and coaching. I see peer learning communities mentioned. Book studies. Allowing learners to choose their own goals. Someone else mentioned problem solving, defining problems and trying to fix it together. Another mention of coaching, if reflective supervision plays a huge role in that. construct coaching, fishbowl coaching, group reflection, individual reflection. Fabulous. Oh, these are all great ideas. Thanks so much for sharing those ideas. It's obvious that many of you at least have a notion of what you want to look like. And I'm also guessing that many of you also provide so many of these supports. And Julie said, asking what they need, especially what resources they need in the classroom. Yes, going directly to them to find out what those needs are.
Felice, you can unmute and ask her question if you'd like.
Oh, sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand from when I talked before.
No problem, Felice. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those ideas, everybody. I think that there seems to be a very strong foundational knowledge of adult learning theory amongst the folks in this virtual room right now. So I'll try to be quick as we talk a little bit more about it. But I think it's good to note that as early childhood people, a lot of our time is focused on questions about child development, about family engagement, about affecting student learning. But we also have to remember that how we learn as adults is really critical to effective PD that changes our teacher and family support practices and improves that student learning. And when we deepen our understanding of adult learning theory, and we're better able to understand, first of all, our own learning, but also we're better able to offer those learning experiences that are going to have relevance to our teachers and to our staff. There's a gentleman whose name is Malcolm Knowles. And Malcolm Knowles is known as the father of andragogy, which is a really fancy way of saying the science of how adults learn. It's a little different from pedagogy, which is technically the science of how children learn. We all talk about pedagogy or pedagogical methods. Andragogy is just applying that in the adult realm. I don't know if anybody's familiar with his theory of adult learning, but some of you have already laid out a lot of the adult learning principles that he has identified and speaks about. And he has 5 basic assumptions about adult self-concept, about the wealth of experiences they bring to tables, about their own readiness to learn, about their orientation to learning, and about what motivates them to learn. And from these different assumptions, he drew conclusions about what he thinks needs to be considered when we're developing a training or a learning experience, which is to say, professional development for adults. First, adults need to know why they need to learn something. What's the reason or purpose for learning a new skill or new knowledge? How is it going to benefit me, or how is it going to benefit the people that I support, which in our case is going to be children and families? Second, he says, adults need to learn experientially by doing. They don't just need to hear about it in an abstract way. They need to actually experience it. They need to experiment. They need to get their hands dirty. They need to be given permission to try new things and possibly to fail at them, but also to have help in unpacking those things that maybe didn't work, to identify what they would do differently next time, and then make their attempts even more effective. Third, he says that adults approach learning as problem solving, which is a fancy way of saying that learning needs to address real problems of practice and lead to real results. And fourth, Knowles says, adults learn best when that topic is of immediate value to them. It needs to address real issues and problems of practice they encounter as part of their job and that they're wrestling with on an ongoing basis. Now, I don't think that this list is exhaustive. I think it's a great list. I think there are probably many other implications that we could draw that are equally as valid. This provides a good foundation or a place for us to start as we think about adult learners. How is this helpful to us? When we're trying to create really valuable PD for our staff, we need to design really effective learning experiences activities that are going to engage those adults as well as provide support and teach reflective practices, with an emphasis on practicing and applying new skills. And traditional approaches alone aren't enough to cultivate the professional growth of early childhood professionals. So if we want to encourage a culture in our programs that values knowledge and growth, we need programs that commit to providing PD routines and formats that most effectively support adult learning. I want to share another video with you right now. This is a video that highlights 4 leaders from early childhood programs and how they experienced the shift from a traditional approach to professional development over to an embedded professional development model. While the video plays, I want you to think about these questions. First, what changes in mindset, in methods, or practice are you hearing these leaders describe? Second, what are some of these specific routines or practices that they mention in this video? And third, what adult learning principles do you think are being addressed through the practices and routines they're describing? I'll share those questions again after we watch the video. For now, just be listening for those changes in mindset and practice and the different kinds of routines or practices that they do mention.
Well, before in the past, it was really, going to workshops and then coming back and either like presenting like at a staff meeting or, sharing with a co-teacher and maybe making copies of the handouts and sharing with everybody, and hoping that you would maintain it. And, like you came back with all these really great ideas. But if no one else seen like the benefit, it's kind of fizzled out and it wouldn't really go anywhere. So that's how it used to be.
Professional development is a process. It's a continuous, ongoing process. It's not a one-time event that occurs and you expect practices to be improved. So not only can we send them to a training, we can then come alongside them and observe the practice and use the team of teachers from other classrooms to look at the work. So the process of I3, where we had the reflective practice group meetings, where we're looking at various observations and classroom practices and then talking about those practices, is how the teachers were able to really grow through the professional development. And so they didn't feel that they were isolated, that sometimes the same problems that may be happening in one other room is the same as they're experiencing.
I think it has opened me as well, because in the past I would just do observations in the room. I would just choose the time, go in, observe, and then just give feedback. Having the time to really reflect, really meet with them and collaborate, and to discuss back and forth helps me to really see how they think about teaching, how they process it. And it gives me a better understanding of how to support them. In the beginning, I wasn't sure how to support them because all I would look at was what I seen when I observed. But I never had taken the time to really discuss what it was that they needed from me. So oftentimes I find myself saying now, how can I support you? Instead of just giving them the information, it's more back and forth. So what do you need from me to help you do this? And so me facilitating has given me, I've taken on a different role overall. So I'm no longer just giving, but it's back and forth. So it's reciprocal. And I think it helps my relationship with the teachers as well, with them knowing that I'm willing to listen to what they have to say. And I think it makes them open to what I have to say as well. And so it changes the dynamics of the relationships that we have. And I think it helps make them better teachers, help me become a better supervisor. And it's not just like, I can't think of the word for it, but like constantly just giving them directives.
But what the lesson planning meeting has done is that sometimes they can get stuck. Or there's so many things thrown at them in early childhood, different standards, there's NACE, you've got Head Start, we have class assessments, there's ECHRs, there's all sorts of things. So how do they sort of make sure on a weekly basis that they're looking at children's data, they're looking at where their children are at, figuring out what can they do to help children get to the next level, having a conversation together as a team, not like you're going to do lesson planning one week, I'll do it the second week, but that it's a team effort because we're working with the same group of children and we have different perspectives. And then also adding in the family piece.
So through the reflective practice group, through the coaching, looking at the observations, reviewing the data, then it helped us become more able to provide the kind of child caring practices we were hoping to achieve, the outcomes we wanted.
The next checkpoint, I saw growth in literacy, and it was because we focused on it. And so I see that when you are saying, let's focus on instruction, let's focus on children's learning, that teachers are able to do it, and then you can see the outcome in children. And it was so immediate that it was gratifying.
So right now, everyone's learning together, growing together. So the PD is much more effective than the traditional, I would say.
Thanks, Susie, for putting those questions in the chat for people to be thinking about as well. And thank you to everybody who were putting those comments in the chat. I was able to read them as you were responding in real time to that video. Love to hear from you now. And again, feel free to use the chat, or if you're feeling brave, like Felice was, or to use to unmute yourself like Felice did, or use the chat if you prefer. What did you hear the leaders say in this video? And what changes in mindset, methods, or practice did you hear them describe? How did things change for these leaders?
I'll come off mute, Chris.
Thanks, Mary. Go ahead.
The biggest thing I heard from the one administrator was reciprocity, the back and forth.
Yeah. She said a lot about that, didn't she? About how it moved from being directive, telling people what to do, to a conversation or a partnership, a dialogue between herself and her teachers. Thank you. Huge difference for her. Someone else mentioned that as well. I see reciprocity mentioned. Another person mentioned reflective supervision and topics that were limited and focused, so narrowly focused on problems of practice. Someone else mentioned collaborative system, a collaborative system that allows sharing between leaders and teachers themselves. Annie is mentioning here, asking what I can do in the relationship. So going to the leader or to teachers and staff and asking what their needs and concerns are, not making their assumptions based on what we think they need, but hearing from them. Christy mentions real conversations. Another leader mentions, how can I support you? Again, asking our staff, what are the areas in which you want or need to grow? Wendy mentioned extending those discussions after a training. So it has to be sustained supports over time. Lisa reinforced that as well. Professional development is continuous learning. It's not a stop and get. You're not just sitting and getting. It has to be built upon. Vicki mentioned providing feedback to staff. Yes, Julie, Puget has a lot to say here, doesn't he? Kathy mentioned the importance of student data. That was one of the routines that we saw, which gets to that second question. What specific routines or practices did you hear them mention? And intentionally looking at student data together, especially a guided conversation involving leaders with teachers is really, really important, and facilitating reflective dialogues. Were there any other specific routines or practices that you heard them mention in there? We did hear about classroom observations. We heard some talk about utilizing student data. What else did these leaders describe as kinds of routines or supports that they try to provide or engage in with staff? Some people are still commenting on what they heard. I see comments talking about the need for regular and ongoing opportunities for these conversations. Anna also mentioned seeing immediate outcomes. So there has to be opportunities to put something in practice. We talk about coaching cycles. It's very similar. And now folks are thinking about those routines. Paula mentioned collaboration between different classrooms. Maribel is mentioning communities of practice, sometimes call those peer learning communities or peer learning groups. Another mention of team lesson planning as one of those routines. We tend to think of that as a given, but it can look very, very different depending on what our expectations are and how we support it. Julie mentioned the number one most important and perhaps most difficult aspect of all this, protecting and dedicating time to make it happen. Your time and their time. Someone else mentioned that what you focus on, you get more of. That's true. We tend to pay attention to the things that we know we're being observed about, or we know that our leaders are elevating as important. A focus on improving instruction in children's learning is really has to be paramount. And another conversation about purposeful data and opportunities to unpack that data. What about that last question that we have on the slide here? What adult learning principles do you think are being addressed through these PD practices? Call them adult learning principles or the needs of adult learners. What's being met when we provide these options for them, these opportunities for learning, for collaboration? And I'm watching the chat, but also happy to hear from anybody who would like to unmute themselves. And if you want to raise your hand, feel free to do so and use that function. We're getting some comments in. So intrinsic motivation. How do you see intrinsic motivation as being motivated or as being referenced in the learning that we saw described? Someone else mentioned learning is relevant to current practice. So it's about their own needs and the things that matter to them as professionals. Giving leaders a say in their own PD, giving them ownership of their own learning. Someone else mentioned individualization of learning. So not one size fits all, but differentiating and individualizing for adults just as we do for children. Someone else mentioned having different ways to learn, different approaches, visual, auditory, hands-on, those modalities. Different people respond in different ways. Another mention of relevance, but also that it has to do relevance because it means they're not doing something extra. They're addressing real issues that they're wrestling with on a daily basis. Maureen mentioned learning from other learner backgrounds. So the value of collaboration because of the multiple perspectives that come in when we have the opportunity to learn from peers. Wendy also highlighted solving difficulties in the classroom or wanted improvements. Another mention of ownership, of working collaboratively, not just to learn, but in bold caps, to implement. It's not just an idea, but a hands-on approach that is a focal point for more than one session. Absolutely, Renee. Happens over time. And it also means demonstrating some flexibility, understanding that just like children, everyone learns differently and is at a different point in their learning journey. And that's also going to vary based on the skill set or the content that we're talking about too. We need to be able to adapt to those individual needs. And thanks, Kate. Learning as problem solving. Thank you so much, everybody. Those are fabulous responses. Love what you gleaned from that short video and those conversations with those 4 leaders. We're going to move on. We did promise that we're going to be spending a little bit time of breakout rooms. And at this point, we're going to be going now into trios in breakout rooms. When you get into those breakout rooms, I want to encourage you to please turn on your cameras. Let's try to make it as personable as possible within the limitations of this virtual experience. Also, unmute your mics. And first, introduce yourselves to each other. And then, in that room, I'd like you to respond to these two questions in your small group. First, what are the types of professional development that you think best lend themselves to those principles of effective adult learning? And second, what would professional development that truly results in transferring new knowledge into practice look like? Feel free to go as deep as you want to with this, but let's think about not just abstractly, but specifically what it does look like or could look like in your own programs. What kinds of routines, what kind of experiences are going to be most effective for adult learners? And if you have examples from your own practice, things that you've experienced or things that you are currently providing, please do share. 10 minutes, and when we pull everybody back, we want to hear from a few people. So please be prepared to share out on behalf of yourself and your group. As we wait for the remainder of our participants to come back and join us out of those breakout rooms, I would love to hear from you. What did you discuss in your groups? What kinds of PD do you think best lend themselves to those principles? What would it look like? What does it look like in your program? Anybody who'd be willing to unmute themselves so we could hear from 2 or 3 people around this? Please raise your hand and speak up. Hi, Emily, go ahead. Oh, maybe that was preemptive, sorry.
I did not hear exactly what you said because I think we were all still coming in the room.
No problem, Amy, but we are here responding. I wanted to hear from a few groups and what you discussed in response to these questions. Are you willing to start us off and share?
Well, I will. I'm not shy.
Thank you.
I don't know if all groups were just 2 people, if that was the norm.
That was not the expectation, but someone may not have been able to join or had to step away.
Okay, so our group was 2 people, and we just kind of shared like what we're each doing right now. So the person I was with, and I'm sorry if I say the wrong number, she had in the somewhere 20 some classrooms. So, and I asked her if they all come together as a whole group to receive professional development, and she said yes. And so I also have 34 classrooms under our umbrella, and we also come together as a whole group for professional development throughout the year. And so we talked a lot about like, is that the best way? Like, I really am intrigued by this this training, because am I doing a disservice by, bringing them all in one space? Because then we're adding paras, then we're adding family educators. It begins to be for us about a group of 75 people to 80.
Yeah.
And so should we be doing that for really? So that was kind of, thinking about the way people learn. And then, we talked about different avenues of how we could maybe break that up and do 2 different sessions in 2 different locations. And then people could choose their learning that they joined in that day. But then we also have times where we just all need to get together because it's more like a big giant staff meeting, because they all need to hear the same information at the same time based over protocols and new information coming from the state. So is that the right way? So that was kind of what we were discussing.
I'm so glad the 2 of you were asking yourselves those hard questions. We've always, I mean, I don't have one good answer for you. Nor is it my place to provide that. I think there's value in bringing everybody together, just like you said, so that we're all receiving the same base information. But there's also value after that in being able to go into small groups and differentiate based on the needs of the participants. So maybe there's a balance to be found with both of them, but it sounds like the 2 of you were really, really wrestling with that and thinking about what it might look like.
Well, and also on top of that, is the best learning happening with instructional coaching? where it's more individualized. It's they're choosing goals, someone's coming to them, they're you know, talking about those goals and doing reflection on themselves personally outside of a giant group. So that was the other key, like, is that way more effective?
Amy, thank you so much for starting us off and sharing those. It sounds like the two of you had a great discussion. Maybe didn't come to any definitive answers, but you're asking the right questions. Julie, thanks for raising your hand. We'd love to hear what you and your group discussed as well.
Well, before again, I was in a group of two, but before I respond to that, I would like to segue off of what Amy said, and it's a question that I've had for a long time. Is I hear the terms training and professional development used interchangeably, and I think there's a difference, but I'd love to know, Chris, what your take on that is. And the one takeaway from the group I was in was cultural competency training and learning to be more inclusive as meeting one of the principles of learning.
Julie,
sorry, threw a lot of it at you, Chris.
No, those are great. And I do want to say in response to your first question, training versus PD, are they the same or different? I think that I will say really quickly that knowledge building is one form of professional development, but that it often is where professional development begins and ends for most of us. So I think it's an essential component, but not the only component. And when we come together on April 10, we want to unpack what we think the different components of an effective, aligned, job-embedded PD system are. So hold that thought. We're going to come back to it.
Okay, thank you.
And your second comment or question, I was so focused on the first. Could you repeat it, please?
We just talked a little bit about training in cultural competency.
Cultural competency,
learning
yes.
to be more inclusive. Adults and children.
I love that. And I think that needs to be an aspect of everything that we do. It can both be a goal, a content of professional development. It can also be reflected in the way that we structure and facilitate those experiences. Again, I think that's something that I want to put in the back burner for now, but I'm so glad you mentioned it because that should be considered. And that contributes to our larger goals that I think so many of us are aware of and aspire to, which has to do with that question of equity as well. Being culturally competent and knowing the children and families that we serve, but also recognizing that so many of our staff are diverse and bring their own cultural backgrounds and experiences. And that's going to result in different understandings and needs too, as learners and as people. So thank you for mentioning that. Julie, Amy, thank you so much for getting us started. I'm sure that there were lots of other amazing conversations that I wish we could tap into right now. I'm intensely aware of how quickly 90 minutes goes, so we're going to move on. But thank you to everybody, to both of you for sharing and to everybody who was willing to do so. In the time that we have remaining, I want to look a little more closely at some common definitions of professional development across the early childhood field. I'm sure you're all aware that every leading organization in early childhood also has a definition of professional development. NACCE has a definition. Head Start has a definition. Early Head Start has a definition. Each state pre-K and child care organization has one. So does each organization that works in support of early childhood educators. What we'd like to do for a few moments right now is dig into a few of the better known definitions right now and see how they have defined effective professional development. In the chat, we're going to be sharing a link that will take you to a resource that's called Defining Professional Development. And it's going to look slightly different than the image on the front, the image that you see on the screen here. It's a slightly different version of it, but the content is the same. Please try to open it right now so that you can access it and reference it. As I said, this contains definitions of professional development from 3 major early childhood organizations in our field. One is from NACCE, one is from the National Professional Development Center on Inclusion, and the third definition is from Head Start. My original plan was to go into breakout groups of 6 for 15 minutes to do the following, but I think that 15 minutes is going to take us up to the end. So here's what I'd like to encourage you to do. In 10 minutes, go into your groups, quickly introduce yourselves, and recognize that there are 3 definitions and that you want to divide them equally among the members of your group. So 2 people could take 1 definition, 2 people could take the second, 2 people could take the third. Read quickly through that definition, and as you're reading through it, think about what are the key elements or characteristics that are describing. How do they align with what we know about the needs of adult learners, and which ones are in place in your program? Then, after you've had a chance to quickly read through it, try to share out with each other and identify what might be the same or different of those in those definitions and how each one embodies effective adult professional development. Now, I'm well aware that in having said that, this is going to go really quickly and you may not have a chance to address all of those. But at the very least, I'd like you to pull out what you see as some of the big key elements or characteristics and be able to compare them across those definitions. So Susie, if we're able to make that change very quickly, could we take 10 minutes as opposed to 15 and go back into those groups together?
We can do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back, everyone. 10 minutes goes by very quickly, doesn't it?
We're still in the midst of talking, so we didn't get to finish.
That's quite all right, Yania. Didn't expect that you would at this point, but hopefully you had a chance to at least read the definitions and begin to discuss some of them.
Yes, yes.
So, very curious to know, and I don't know if you want to speak on behalf of your group. I don't mean to make make you put you on the spot here, but what were some of the common trends across these definitions in terms of key elements or characteristics that your group noticed?
I think the common trends were the continuum of learning. It's an ongoing learning process, and that it could be both individual and group learning. So it's based on the staff needs, and then being able to identify the outcomes and follow-up support, like individual career development, and then not just, like you said, leaving it there. It continues. Like there are strategies, then you give them something, then you help support those strategies. You learn something, and then you also have time to practice those strategies. So it's just an ever resounding continuum, but it's based on staff needs and their assessment of what their needs are.
Ms. Williams, your check is in the mail. Thank you. That was perfect.
I'll be looking for it. Thank you so much. No.
All right. Great points from you and your group. You mentioned the continuum of learning, but the thing that I heard you emphasize more than anything else was the importance of transfer to practice, of the extension of learning beyond just knowledge building. Anybody else who'd like to unmute themselves and share out those key ideas or how it might align with what we know about adult learners? What jumped out for you and your group? I see some comments coming in the chat box right here.
Speak, but I wanted to say opportunities for feedback, as far as some bosses or superiors don't like the lower people at the bottom to speak up for themselves as far as what they feel like they need, like reflection of our roles and the flexibility in our learning approaches. Everybody don't learn at the same pace. And some people, they take that for granted and don't take it into consideration for adult learners.
I think in our group, we noticed that the only place we're seeing the principles of adult learning written anywhere in this is in the NACE definition.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I got cut off for a moment. Glad it lasted really long. Let me just begin share my screen again.
and we had two people very bravely come off mute and share. I wasn't able to catch your names though, if you had a chance to reshare what you said.
Sorry, I think I was one of them. We noticed in our group where we actually saw the words principles of adult learning was in the NACE definition.
Ah, so they're not just paying lip service to it, but actually mentioning what those principles.
Right.
Even if they had said what those principles are. Angela, in your group, did you see how those principles might be expanded on or demonstrated in those definitions, or what they recommend?
Well, I think we were kind of comparing, and maybe this serves the next question a little bit better, where we were kind of surprised when we read the NACE definition. It felt like we were addressing the needs of the adults, that were addressing the needs of the children, we're addressing, just kind of a whole child, whole adult approach. And then, but then when we were reading the Head Start one, it was you get 15 hours. We're going to be able to, we're going to train you. We're going to show you these things. We're going to offer support, afterwards. I also saw evaluation and made me think, it kind of sounds like their way or the highway. This is how you're going to do it. It just might be a personal, I don't know, interpretation there, but it just kind of, in comparison, the NACE kind of sound like what our group said was their way or the highway.
I can see how it would be interpreted that way, and I wonder if that was the intent as it was being written, but it feels that way, or it could be seen to feel that way. That part of it feels very, very group-centered or directive. But I think there are other aspects of the definition that might help to mitigate that a little bit, because they do talk about follow-up with transfer to practice supports. And if you've ever been in Head Start, you know the emphasis they put on things like coaching and reflective practice, but it requires some digging and a little more unpacking. Thank you very much, Angela. Thanks, everybody. We share these definitions with you not because we think that any one of these definitions is perfect. I think there are elements in each of these that we can value, but also elements that we may not, in light of what we've been discussing today, find as important, or that we might put as kind of secondary priorities. I hope that as you're wrestling with these questions, as so many of you have been, even in these last 90 minutes, you're thinking about what aspects of these definitions resonate with you, or maybe provide you with some guidance or a path forward as we think about changes that you might make to your own PD offerings, as you try to begin to embed professional development in your programs. In the interest of time, we're going to move on. I want to wrap things up today just by thinking a little bit more and summarizing some ideas about professional development as traditionally understood versus job-embedded professional development, and highlight what we think some of those differences are. When we talk about traditional PD, this is usually, I think, how most people in early childhood experience it. Certainly was how I did for most of the time. Oftentimes it means protected time quarterly, once or twice a year for a PD day. It's our in-service, it's our pre-service, it's when we close. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't get me wrong, but that's often where it begins and ends. It might also be sent in someplace, include being sent someplace to take a class, or maybe go to a conference. Or it often involves an expert or a consultant who comes in to provide that in-house training. And I'm not trying to suggest that there's no value in any of these. Please don't get me wrong. We need that protected time. There's great value in going to conferences, in doing coursework, or in getting outside help. But there can be tremendous value in those structures for knowledge development. But when it comes to transfer to practice and taking next steps beyond it, we have to provide more. And so many educators and people in our field have not experienced those transfer to practice support. Their experience usually begin and stop right there, just with more is needed through PD that occurs more than just a few times a year, and that provides for staff in both content and format. So we want to leave you with this thoughts right now. A comparison of what we think typically defines professional learning as most of us have experienced it, and as many of us are still experiencing it right now, versus what we think are some of the elements of effective job-embedded professional learning. The traditional PD model is the one that you see on the left with that gray box on top. It's largely defined as professional development in which the goals or expectations are set by other people. Oftentimes that's the leadership of a program. You need to learn this, or we need to learn this, whether it's a new curriculum or a new practice. We're often told what we need to learn. There's often an expectation that once we've done that learning, we need to implement it in isolation. Go back to your box, go back to your classroom, and make it happen. Oftentimes, that professional development occurs off-site. It's training, it's workshops, it's conferences that we go to, usually with the groups of strangers or maybe some members from our own center or program. And oftentimes, that professional development, it results in monitoring solely for compliance reasons. We want to make sure that we're checking those boxes. We know that Head Start or another monitoring organization has these expectations of us. We want to make sure that we are complying with those expectations. But oftentimes that's where it begins and ends, or that's primary in the mindsets of our leaders. We really want to advocate for what you see on the right. And this is going to reflect so much of what we've talked about and what you've heard today. Effective job-embedded professional learning is focused on educators co-constructing their improvement goals with leadership. Leadership reaching out to them and saying, what do you need to learn? What do you want to learn? What are your concerns? There's that second bullet point. It results in shared responsibility and professional collaboration. It's peers working together and taking ownership for those changes. There's that third point, that it's routine and involves frequent protected time on site to reflect and problem solve. There's a lot packed into that, but protected time happening on site, and it involves opportunities to reflect and problem solve. And last, it involves observation, coaching, and reflection, those transfer to practice supports towards improved practice. So I hope that you're leaving this conversation right now, sharing our enthusiasm for that model on the right, and that you're actively thinking about ways that you can begin to adopt job-embedded PD model in your program, or if you're already doing it, maybe improve that job-embedded PD that you're already providing. We're going to be continuing this conversation next month during the next Administrators Forum, which, as Jenny reminded us at the beginning, is scheduled for April 10, which is 3 weeks from today. And during that session, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking more carefully at the key characteristics of effective job-embedded learning, as well as the different elements or forms of on-the-job PD that, when they're aligned, are most effective in supporting teachers and staff and helping them to translate knowledge and skills into effective practice. And with that, I'm going to leave you with one last request. We would like to get your feedback on today's experience. If you could please take a moment to either scan the QR code that you see right there, or to follow the link that has just been posted in the chat by Susie. Both of those will take you to the same assessment. There's a few quick questions we'd like you to answer. It shouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time, but we'd really value your thoughts and feedback. So if you're able to do so, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody, for all of your contributions, for your commitment to your own learning and your commitment to the learning of everybody else in your group. Look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks.
Thank you again, Chris. We greatly appreciate everybody joining us today and for your participation. Chris, we look forward to seeing you on April 10th. Just as a reminder to everybody, if you have not yet registered for that session, registration is still open, and you can just register on the ECPL website, which is eclearningil.org. We just posted that link also in the website or in the chat room. And we also want to remind you that the Administrator Conference registration is also still open until April 12th. And that registration is also accessible on the ECPL website. So today you will also be getting a follow-up email from ECPL that is going to have a different link do an evaluation that is a little bit different than what Chris has requested you complete. And that is for Gateways credits and for your evidence of completion. So just watch for that. That'll probably be coming through sometime tomorrow. And it is an email that will be coming from ECPL, which is the same email address that you received your confirmation and reminder for this session. So I think that's about it. We greatly appreciate you joining us today. I will keep the room open for a few more moments. I know we did close at 2:30, but if anybody does have any last minute questions for Chris or comments, please type them in the chat room at this time before we close. Thank you.